Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be Part 5, Day 10. Just for reference, Chapter 18 is the first chapter in this set. It does not have a day listed, and the only word for that chapter is tired. Day 10. Izuku's condition crashed. Words like ductal constriction and acidosis and renal failure were thrown around. Not long after, Izuku was taken away for surgery on his heart. They were hoping they would be able to wait until he was big enough for a single correction surgery, but he needed surgical treatment now. They would have to use a two-step correction method, which was less preferable, although any surgery on an infant of Izuku's weight was far from preferable. It was incredibly risky. Izashi sat in his chair, the monitor silent beside him. He stared blankly at Izuku's baby blanket and tiny sunshine hat, held tightly in shaking hands. What would he do if Izuku didn't come back? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He wanted his baby back. He wanted his family back. All For One's information was true. All of it. Every single bit was true, and there wasn't a single trick to be found. The first thing they investigated was the Shimura household. It seemed the least likely to have a trick attached, especially since the address All For One had given was in a very residential area. There were no tricks. All Might had knocked on the door to ask if they had been in contact with anyone suspicious, only to have Nana's son slam the door in his face with an enraged snarl. All Might had left his information in the hopes that Kotaro would get in contact with him later on, only to receive an excited call from his young children instead. It had been cute, had the call not ended with Nana's son catching them. The argument he'd heard over the phone weighed on All Might's heart. All For One's simple statement that the man was abusive weighed heavier still. The rest of the information verification required some measure of research and stealth, which All Might could not provide. Night-Eye was happy to help, as was Nezu. Nezu wasn't normally brought into hero operations these days, busy as he was with UA, but this was an exception. This was clearly not a normal plot. After research and the recruitment of some underground heroes for physical confirmation from the addresses given, they had the proof that All For One was telling the truth, which left All Might, Night-Eye, and Gran Torino all sitting in Nezu's office at UA, pictures and research documents strewn about. It didn't make any sense. All Might stared down at the picture of the Nomu, All For One had called it, floating in a vat of glowing liquid. It was an abomination, a perverse desecration of a dead body, a monster born from the corruption of a corpse. Animal bodies, yes, but it wasn't too much of a logical leap to assume that human bodies would be next. His hand shook as he held the picture, just barely keeping his rage in check. It was clear a lot of research had gone into the production of these monsters. The amount of scientific writing Nezu had fished up from the doctor All For One mentioned was immense, and the ones in the pictures looked developed, and yet All Might had never fought one, or even heard of them. All For One was just throwing this project away, giving it to them in the full expectation the Nomu would be destroyed, which they would, but still, it didn't make any sense. It would make more sense to give away the location of one warehouse of these things, but he had given all of them, and even the name and location of the presumed co-creator. That wasn't a trick, that was just... With all due respect, Nezu, Gran said gruffly, sitting back in the chair in Nezu's office. This doesn't make any sense. It is curious, isn't it? Nezu said cheerfully, sipping on his tea. All For One has willingly put one of the arteries of his empire on the chopping block. He might as well have put the knife in our hands. It is very interesting. It doesn't make sense, All Might muttered, picking up another photo to glare at. There has to be a trap somewhere. A trick, a plan. He wouldn't... Night-Eye cleared his throat. The underground heroes noted that the Nomu locations and the orphanages were minimally guarded. They were likely relying on secrecy to blend in unnoticeably. Taking these locations down and getting the victims out would be laughably easy. He noted from across the room. It doesn't seem that they've been notified of a leak at their location, or connections, or anything. But just how reliable is this information? I don't think we should trust anything handed to us on a silver platter by the devil, Gran had pointed out. To add, what are we supposed to do after we deal with this information? Night-Eye asked. What is the purpose of this truce All For One seems to be attempting? Is this a distraction to keep us busy so that he can go back to business as usual once he leaves the hospital? Nezu hummed, taking another sip of his tea. I propose a different problem, Nezu said as he set down his cup. What shall we do if All for One peacefully surrenders? All Might dropped the photo and stared at Nezu. He could see Gran and Night Eye staring too. That's not possible, Nezu, All Might said. I disagree, Nezu said cheerfully. I think it is very possible. In fact, I think that is the very situation we are in. Gran grunted, folding his arms. Explain, so the rest of us non-geniuses can understand. Nezu squeaked a laugh as he folded his paws in his lap. It's actually quite simple. You would be able to see it as well if you prevented your biases from clouding your judgment. Nezu looked up, looking them in the eye in turn. All for One's motives are simple, and the execution of what he wants depends on our decisions. Thus his information is trustworthy. And what is his motive, then? Night Eye asked, though it sounded like he was expecting the answer. All for One wants to stay with his medically fragile son, who needs care his contacts cannot provide. Therefore, he is surrendering, Nezu said. Silence. Nezu took a sip of his tea. You really think that bastard has enough of a heart to throw away his entire damn empire for a dying baby? Gran asked lowly. I don't know, Nezu said with a smile. But evidence points toward this conclusion. Humans have children that are defenseless and heavily dependent on their caretakers, and that results in biological changes in the parents. These changes in turn can result in dramatically changed behavior, although I doubt that is the only reason All for One has chosen to make his decision. For that, we must consider the history of your quirk, All Might, Nezu said, bowing his head to All Might. All Might narrowed his eyes. What does One for All have to do with any of this? One for All came about because of All for One's younger brother, whom he clearly cared for on some level. Therefore, it is not out of the range of possibility that All for One may be sentimental toward his son, Nezu pointed out. All Might tapped his fingers, looking off to the side. Nezu had a point, but... We don't even know if that child is his, Nezu. He was transferred to that hospital. He could have kidnapped that child en route. He could have, Nezu acquiesced. But for what purpose? All Might didn't have an answer. I think if he's slowing down, we should just take the chance to throw him in Tartarus and let him rot, Gran grumbled. I think that would be a bad idea, Nezu said. Why not? All Might asked. If we have the chance, we should... For all intents and purposes, the main reason he seems to be stepping down is his child, Nezu said softly. If we rebuke his attempts at peace, take away his chance at being with his son, he may tear the world down trying to get him back. I'm sure we all recall the Arima incident. Heads around the room nodded, asynchronously, all except All Might's. That sounds familiar, All Might said. But I don't know the details. Nezu smiled and took another sip of his tea. Ah, of course. It was while you were in America, wasn't it? I'll explain. Arima was a villain from Hokkaido, whose quirk allowed her to accelerate the effects of time within a limited area. She primarily used this for fairly mundane villainy. Robberies were her specialty, and she only had a few deaths to her name until... Gran Torino spat out a sharp shit between clenched teeth. Her kid, he muttered. Nezu nodded once. Yes, her child. Someone discovered her true identity, and when social services took her child because of it, Arima began what can only be described as a campaign of terror. By the time it was done, tens of thousands across Hokkaido were dead, and the Seiken tunnel was damaged enough to be closed for nearly a year and a half. Silence reigned for a few moments before All Might spoke again. I don't see how that matters here. It matters because it's a precedent. If a C-tier villain can, in the course of a few days, cause that much damage because her child was taken, imagine what someone like All for One could cause. Well, obviously she was stopped. Yes, Nezu said, something sharp in his tone pinching the edges of the word. When she was killed. Are you certain enough in your ability to kill All for One? Should it come to that? The only way I would ever leave Izuku's side is if I were dead. All Might pursed his lips, hands curling into fists. He said nothing. The clock ticked in the heavy silence. Even if he is his biological child, Night Eye said slowly, I'm not convinced All for One would be a suitable father. If anything, the origin of One for All proves that. You have a point, Night Eye, Nezu said. However, I believe the only way to safely separate All for One from his son without any risk of violence is to convince him the child is safer somewhere else. However, we cannot enter negotiations assuming that is the case. If we do, we risk lowering our chances for a peaceful outcome. If he is willing to cease all villainous activity, something he was not willing to do for his brother, it stands to reason he is willing to take whatever steps must be taken to be a good father. Gran grumbled doubtfully, but Nezu continued. This must, unfortunately, be a meeting of equals, Nezu stated. It must be, for the best possible outcome for the greatest number of people. I can't meet him again, All Might said, running a hand through his hair. I predicted as such, Nezu said cheerfully. Which is why I am going to Tanima Memorial Hospital today. All Might let out a heavy sigh. Can you at least make sure the baby is actually his? Ring, 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 ring. Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. Call ended. Ring, 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 ring. Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. Call ended. Ring, 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 ring. Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. Call ended. Ring, 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 ring. Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. A soft sniffle. Call ended. Ring, 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 ring. Nezu had never been to a NICU before. He was quite curious about them, as he was curious about everything. He had read extensively on the care that took place in a NICU, as well as the typical conduct of healthcare professionals there, but of course reading paled in comparison to lived experience. He had also never negotiated with a supervillain before, an experience he was quite excited for, if somewhat wary. Nezu was no idiot. He knew the risks involved in negotiating with dangerous humans. However, considering the circumstances, he was not concerned about All for One retaliating. At least not in the hospital. He had a son to consider after all. Although, if Nezu played his cards right, All for One would not be retaliating at all. And Nezu had a reputation as a card shark for more reasons than one. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he was quite eager. He had brought all his vaccination paperwork as required by hospital protocol. Granted, his situation was a little different due to his non-human status, but once it was ascertained it would not be an infection risk, he was let in. A nurse by the name of Anda directed him to All for One's room. She was very professional throughout his interactions, but he noticed stress lining her face, though whether that was because of working with All for One, the condition of All for One's son, or just general work stress was unclear. The door was closed. Nezu knocked, but no one answered. Nezu's nose twitched. The smell of milk and sterile medical equipment was strong in this place, as was the steady sounds of said medical equipment. Nezu was no owl, but he could not hear or smell any of those things from behind the door, though the lack of the scent of milk was not particularly a surprise. According to the hospital report from Musutafu General and his own inferences, All for One's son was likely not old or well enough to handle milk, so he would be relying on IV nutrition. He would need to enter to speak with All for One. However, he did not want to get off on the wrong foot, something All Might had contributed to already. Perhaps he could ask Anda again. Never mind. There was the sound of footsteps. His reaction was delayed. Either something was wrong or he was tired. Either was possible with a premature newborn. Although he did notify the hospital earlier he was coming, All for One may have neglected to heed the warning. Nezu took a step back from the door, his paws clasped behind his back. No matter. It was time to play. The door opened, and Nezu looked up at All for One. He was wearing casual clothes, something Nezu knew was not typical for him, although the t-shirt he was wearing had an image of a vest and a bow tie printed on it. There were dark circles under his eyes, matching the dull, almost vacant look on his face. His posture was stiff, the hand against the door constantly tensing and relaxing. His hair was a mess. He smelled of stress. He was also holding an infant's hat and baby blanket in his free hand. It seemed his first guess was correct. Something was wrong with his son. A pity. The poor thing had done nothing to deserve it, but such was the way of life. Nezu knew that all too well. "Hello," Nezu greeted, polite but not cheerful. Cheer would be inappropriate in a place like this. All for One let out a heavy sigh, mumbling, "Come in," as he turned around and walked back into the room. Nezu followed quickly, closing the door behind him. All for One grabbed a chair and dragged it over to a recliner that was sitting in the middle of the room, which he then fell into with another sigh. His gaze then drifted to the empty incubator next to him, his fingers worried at the blanket clasped in his hands. Nezu climbed into the chair, getting situated. He clasped his paws, letting his gaze settle onto the empty incubator as well. It was not the time to play the cards he had prepared, but that simply meant he needed to play differently. "How is he?" Nezu asked. All for One froze, looking at him slowly. "What?" "How is your son?" Nezu repeated. "I presume things could be going better, considering he is not here at the moment." All for One blinked, his gaze drifted back to the incubator. "He's in surgery," All for One said flatly. "Ah," Nezu said softly. "For what, may I ask?" "Congenital heart defect." "I'm sorry to hear that," Nezu said, and let a silence fall. He had questions, of course, but he was going to wait and see if All for One offered any more information, as well as give him time to process the situation. One of the most powerful cards Nezu had in his deck was patience, after all. All for One stayed silent. "What are his chances?" Nezu asked. All for One let out an unamused huff. "You would have better chances flipping a coin." He paused. They wanted to wait until he was bigger, so they could just do one correction surgery, but... "I see," Nezu said. All for One sighed. "What is it that you want? I know you're here for something." "I was," Nezu said simply. "But I think now is not the time." Nezu slid off his chair. Landing on his feet, All for One blinked. "I will come back another time." All for One said nothing. The look on his face was a shocked one. It almost made Nezu laugh. Of course, the villain would be surprised that heroes could be merciful. "I hope the little one pulls through the procedure. I was looking forward to meeting him," Nezu said as he walked out the door. "Until next time." "Yes," All for One said blankly. Nezu closed the door. "Thank you," he heard through the wood. Nezu's ear twitched. Good game. That being said, he needed a cigarette for his next conversation, which he was most definitely putting off until tomorrow. Izuku came back. Izuku came back. There was gauze taped to his tiny chest, even more monitors and tubes than before. He was still. So still. But his heart still beat. He came back. He lived. Ring, 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 ring. "Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." Beep. "He made it, Inko." A soft laugh, with a hint of a sob. "He came back, Inko. Sobbing. Call ended. All right, listeners. This concludes day 10 of All For You. Hope you all are still enjoying this fic. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to everything so far. And as always, thank you so much for listening.